Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Sharon.
Sorry, my apologies. I was trying to multitask and share my screen at the same time, and clearly it didn't work very well. All right, can everyone see my screen? Excellent. So thanks to BMRC for the opportunity to share this research today. And just in terms of a background, the research was conducted from September to November 2020. This was an exploratory study examining the end-to-end recruitment process, including technology use. And it was a 45-minute in-depth interview with talent acquisition leaders. These were private sector organizations across Canada in varied industries. And half of the respondents interviewed were employed by legislated employment equity program regulated employers, and half by financial post 500 firms that were not regulated by that program. And they were selected at random. I had contacted 177 talent acquisition leaders multiple times to participate. 26 responded and 11 agreed to participate. So I guess that tells us this audience proved very difficult to contact, particularly on this topic. And given the COVID-19 pandemic, that obviously was a factor as well. But I think it also speaks to the challenges of engaging with employers on this very important topic of newcomer employment. Before I move on, I just wanted to thank BMRC for the opportunity to share this research, as well as the RBC Immigrant Diversity and Inclusion Project for funding the study, and a thank you to Dr. John Shields, a moderator who supervised this research. Objectives. So in terms of the objectives of this study, it was really to understand employment recruitment strategies in relation to the hiring of newcomer professionals and managers. And here really understand what practices do or do not promote newcomer skill commensurate employment, and identify and share employer best practices and support program development. How does this relate to social resilience, our topic? So the BMRC and Hull and Lamont, as Jenna talked about earlier, and also Jean-Philippe, social resilience is a dynamic process, and newcomers in that process overcome settlement challenges and secure a future of material, physical, and psychological well-being. And obviously, market participation is really important to this endeavor. There's the material dimension, which is important, but also we know that market participation facilitates social resources, bridging and bonding networks, and belonging. And we also know that newcomers, like their Canadian-born peers, have very strong occupational identities. So commensurate employment is very important to self-esteem and identity as well. And we also know that employment is an important social determinant of health and well-being. Employer practices as well are even more important with Canada's shift to temporary and two-step migration, and Jenna spoke about that. But employer practices in this case can become a barrier to permanent residency and citizenship. In terms of the findings, just a high level, there was significant variability in employer practices, and the potential for a positive or negative impact on newcomer employment. In the respondent interviews, there were many best practices shared, but also some practices that were clearly barriers. Talent acquisition processes are not neutral. I mean, they're embedded in local cultural and organizational understandings, and without modification, they really leave little opportunity for negotiation. Diversity and inclusion strategies with the interviews, they most often focused on Indigenous persons, so kind of the four designated group, or one of the four groups generally were prioritized in these strategies. So Indigenous persons, racialized persons, women, persons with disabilities, and in some cases LGBTQ plus. The other thing was technology use is ubiquitous. It mediates the hiring process in ways that can present unique challenges for newcomers. And just in terms of the D&I strategies as well, you know, just to add that, you know, in focusing on the four groups, that, you know, didn't necessarily, you know, it could, most often newcomers were not a specific part of that, only in a minority of the interviews. Technology and recruitment. So mentioned, it is you know, very important in today's recruitment and sourcing. What came up in the interviews were things like, you know, career websites, you know, either third-party developed or proprietary, and digital platforms such as LinkedIn or Indeed, and they were used pretty universally, both for active and passive searches for candidates for particular jobs. So by passive searches, I mean that you know, employers identified that where they were recruiting for multiple roles or hard to fill roles, or had a number of positions to fill, yeah, that they would have a sourcing group, or, you know, in their recruitment group would search on these platforms and, you know, identify people that may not be looking for a job, but kind of reach out to them. So that was kind of the passive search that was identified. Applicant tracking system use was ubiquitous, so leveraging these systems to, you know, both as the application process, but also to monitor and track progression throughout the process, and for companies to be able to look at what were the best sources for the successful candidates. On-demand video interviewing was also used by 3 of the 11 companies I interviewed. So this technology was either used to supplement the HR telephone screening or in place of it earlier in the recruitment process. And AI recruitment algorithms were used for screening, for that initial screening of resumes, or to supplement it by 2 of the 11 companies that were interviewed. So technology is you know, both a plus and a minus. Certainly it provides advantages in that it allows newcomers to access pre-arrival services and job fairs. And in fact, you know, several of the employers interviewed were very active in that space, and, you know, participating in those job fairs, and were able to you know, recruit talent and be able to offer jobs to newcomers sometimes even before they arrived in Canada. But at the same time, there were some aspects that could create, you know, negative impacts for newcomers and disparate impact. So, for example, I mentioned the use of LinkedIn and other social media platforms, which could present a barrier in that job taxonomies, job titles, you know, things may differ, and, you know, from that respect, if, you know, that's being used to search for passive candidates, you know, then how that presentation and the words used becomes very important and might present a barrier for newcomers. Structured data fields, there's been some research in the States just looking at how such you know, platforms can, and that type of entry and job application process can penalize non-standard work histories. Certainly for newcomers, Jenna spoke about, you know, the multiple jobs, the volunteer work, you know, all of the things that newcomers do, some of the barriers to employment, and how that affects, how your resume might look. And certainly that presents a challenge if you're entering in structured data fields in a kind of reverse chronological order, presents a challenge for self-presentation. Lastly, in terms of the use of AI screening in recruitment and selection, and specifically in looking at screening resumes and criteria, that can present a barrier as well, to the extent that it's based on historic data sets, when we know that newcomers experience higher rates of unemployment and underemployment, so may not be accurately represented in those data sets. So that as well, audits and a lot of rigor around that process becomes really important. So in terms of the interviews and some of the things that were identified as practices that might create barriers for newcomers in achieving skill commensurate employment, but also from an organizational perspective, precluding the recruitment and selection of the most qualified candidates. Some of the things that were identified were job postings privileging local product or institutional knowledge. So, it was brought up that, sometimes on job boards, people would see job descriptions that were just so detailed and, become very localized because of, for some straightforward jobs, there was, just too much requirements that then, start reflecting local product and institutional knowledge. Reliance on social capital, referrals and informal network sourcing are still really important in recruitment. And, this can be a barrier for newcomers, who have moved and, potentially left their network behind. So, this can be a barrier for newcomers. I would say in terms of the interviews, the majority considered international experience equivalent, and some, really highly valued that experience. But there was also respondents that mentioned that they prioritize Canadian experience, and that it was a couple perspectives. One was perception that international experience was not equal or at par. It was also expressed with respect to understanding the Canadian work culture. Another thing that was a potential barrier was the way newcomers might sometimes apply for an adjacent job level, and often it was cited that employers were hesitant to, they wouldn't consider individuals who had more qualifications than the job required. D&I, diversity and inclusion strategies, could also, while they're a positive, they do not always look at intersectional and newcomer specific barriers. The other factor about skill demonstration techniques, so case studies and testing, have been identified as practices that are more inclusive, provided they're not biased. However, these were really used for a small percentage of roles. Other barriers, the absence of training, so cross-cultural training, unconscious bias training, and interview training. So amongst the respondents, a third had mandatory training, covered in these various areas. A third had optional, and a third had no training at all. The decentralized nature of hiring decisions as well, it winds up being, a whole bunch of separate decisions that add up to a workforce. And because of some of the barriers already discussed, that can present some challenges. So it really needs to be an organization-wide strategy with, an awareness of the barriers newcomers face, and strategies to mediate those barriers. Another barrier was lack of measurement. So only 2 of the respondent organizations implemented voluntary self-identification. And just because generally in diversity and inclusion strategies, there were a few companies that were really looking specifically at newcomers. So, you know, if you're not measuring it, you don't really know where in your process or whether the process presents barriers to newcomers. There were also many practices and best practices that were identified by participant organizations that promote newcomer commensurate employment, and those were focusing on transferable skills. So many companies were doing that. As well, many of the organizations were engaged in outreach programs. So employment service agency, immigrant employment and settlement agencies, job fairs, that online job fairs that were accessing international talent or pre-arrival services. So there was involvement there. Structured interview process. Some had a very standardized and structured process, and diverse hiring committees with mandatory training. There were many that were very specific on their efforts to get away from things such as fit and more discretionary criteria that might introduce bias. As I mentioned, for a small proportion of roles, there was testing and case studies involved, which are a positive, have been found to be so in past research. And some of the companies as well measured and refined their process. And as I mentioned, really important was active engagement with ISAs and newcomer communities. So the companies that were really active in this space, spoke to one, their ability to attract top talent through engaging with these newcomer communities and immigrant serving agencies, but also they also spoke to how it really helped their organizations understand the barriers that newcomers faced, and then they could in turn revise their talent and recruitment strategies to make sure that they were as unbiased as possible and that they were able to mitigate these barriers. So just in terms of some high-level implications, I think the interviewers that were engaging with ISAs and newcomer communities really spoke to the benefits. And there's, I think, the opportunity there is for scale up, for some of the programs, the mentoring programs, some of the bridging programs that employers were engaging with ISAs in, that there's a real opportunity there to leverage the settlement sector. The other piece, of course, is that employer engagement and process modification is critical. So the the employers have that critical role in terms of making commensurate employment available, or being, in contrast and from a negative standpoint, being that barrier or that roadblock. So it's really critical that that employers do engage. There's an organizational wide strategy as such, and the role of talent acquisition and working with ISAs and others is really critical as well. So programs to engage employers become really important, particularly given the experience with this research in terms of how challenging it can be to reach that audience. And I think the other, in terms of the processes, the interviews revealed that it's really important to treat newcomers fairly. A different approach is really required. And then lastly, government intervention, is needed. Came up in the interviews actually about shortages that were being experienced because government regulated professions, weren't recognizing credentials from different countries, and created shortages for various employers. That piece needs to be addressed.
2-minute warning, Sharon.
Okay, which has obviously come up in much of the research on the topic, and the other piece being the Ontario 2013 Human Rights Act amendments to in terms of the Canadian experience, and identifying that that is discrimination. There definitely needs to be more of that type of regulation and education as well across Canada. And that is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's terrific. Maybe I can lead off.